So the question that really interested me concerns values, moral values or social values, and where they come from. I mean, they're obviously not in the world in the way that the tides and the sun is in the world. And yet, on the other hand, they matter terribly to us because they are an integral part of our social lives. And they have a lot to do with how we get on with others, whether we prosper, and whether we have well-being. And so the question that I was really puzzled by, and have been for a long time, is where values come from. Now, in a certain sense, we really have all known, I think, since the 19th century, that at some point we must make contact in answering that question with the evolution of mammals and with the evolution of the mammalian brain. But how exactly that story should go has, I think, remained slightly out of reach, at least until fairly recently. Darwin speculated on this question, and like Aristotle, he made the observation that many animals seem to be social by nature. Not just humans, but also chimpanzees and baboons, wolves and dolphins. And what can that mean, to be social by nature, exactly? He also realized, as did Aristotle and as did Hume before him, that habits and the acquisition by the young through living in a social context, the acquisition of an understanding of social practices, of habits and skills, is essential in answering that question. And finally, that somehow, especially in animals with big brains, such as chimpanzees and baboons and humans, that reasoning and problem solving plays an important role. And the question still remains what that role is. Now, another important aspect, I think, in trying to address this question is to put it into the context of what, over the past 100 years, we have learned from anthropologists and archaeologists about our evolutionary past. On the vertical axis are years in millions, and on the horizontal axis is space. And of course, what you will see is that there are hominins that go back 2 million years. The last common ancestor of hominins and chimpanzees is about 5 million years ago. So what you're looking at is from 2 million years on. And what you will see is that there are many kinds of hominins. And I want to just say a little bit about Homo erectus. So notice that Homo erectus began to populate Africa about 1.4 million years ago. He had a brain that was about 800 cc's. Yours is between about 1,300 and 1,500 cc's. So it was quite a bit smaller. But notice that the guys lasted a long time. And not only did they last a long time, but they got themselves, probably via rafts that they built out of wood lashed together with vines, they got themselves to Indonesia. And what archaeologists and anthropologists think is that Homo sapiens, our kind of guys, came into Africa or began to emerge and populate Africa between 200 and 300,000 years ago. And for most of that 200 or 300,000 years, they lived in very small groups, gathering, hunting, and scavenging. Now, part of the reason I want to mention this is just kind of to put it in perspective. That almost certainly, for example, Homo erectus did not have anything like an organized religion, such that there was a God as lawgiver who provided commands. In fact, almost certainly no Homo sapiens had organized religions with a God as lawgiver who provided commands until maybe about 10,000 years ago. So for at least about 200,000 years, did they lack morals? Almost certainly not. Because like chimpanzees and baboons, as we now know, or like other hunter-gatherer societies that have been studied by anthropologists, they had ways of getting along. They had social practices that they abided by. They had ways of dividing resources. They had ways of reconciling after conflict. They had ways of dealing with individuals who were particularly problematic. So they were not without moral behavior, and yet they did not have anything that could constitute something like an organized religion, nor probably did they have much in the way of explicit laws. Writing was not invented until about 5,000 years ago, and many hunter-gatherer cultures that we know of now never did have it. Did they lack norms or social practices to which members of the group conformed? No, of course they didn't. They had that kind of sociality that guided the behavior within the group. And so it seems from what we know anthropologically that almost certainly moral behavior, or certainly social behavior that conformed to certain kinds of practices, existed antecedently both of organized religion and of explicitly stated laws. So where do the values come from? The hypothesis that I want to talk about tonight goes like this: that sociability turns out to be a basic value for social mammals. And essentially all mammals are social, at least to some minimal degree. That sociality then was advantageous, partly because you could hunt cooperatively and you could also defend cooperatively. And so it would be selected for in the course of biological evolution. What we know more recently concerns the brain. And here the story depends greatly, but certainly not exclusively, on a very ancient peptide that we see in all vertebrates, but which was put to very new uses in the case of mammals. And that is the peptide oxytocin, which has a sibling which is very similar to it called vasopressin. And together they play this very important role that's completely new in mammalian and also avian behavior. I'm going to leave the birds aside, partly because their brains are different, at least structurally from the surface. And if we can talk about that in the question period if you want. So I'm mainly going to focus on mammals. That in addition to the importance of oxytocin, which I shall elaborate on shortly, the acquisition of social behavior is enhanced by the reward system, by approval and disapproval, and by shunning and by punishing. It's also elaborated with the expansion of prefrontal structures, of all that fancy stuff in your brain that's right there, which we know has a lot to do with planning, executive function, and being able to calculate what's likely to happen as consequences in the first step and the second step and so forth. So the basic idea that I'm going to explore with you tonight then is that attachment and trust are the platform for moral values in mammals, and that of course includes us. They give rise in the brain to dispositions that contour our social space, that make certain kinds of solutions to social problems highly probable and effective and stable. That they constitute within the motivational and drive system the motivation to find good solutions to practical social problems, to find ways of solving social problems that will maximize the stability and the well-being of the group. Social problem solving then is likely enhanced by the enlarged prefrontal cortex, which allows us, amongst other things, but this is also true in rats that have a smaller prefrontal cortex, to repress, to calculate, and to plan. Much of what we call impulse control seems to have a lot to do not just with the subcortical structures, which are very important, but also the relation to the cortex. What else turns out to be important in all social mammals is keeping track of who did what to whom. That's part of the memory system, and we need to know that because we need to know if someone is irascible or generous, or if they're apt to have poor judgment or be impulsive, and so forth. Now, although I am going to focus largely on what I think of as the neurobiological component of this story, certainly culture is extremely important. There has been tremendous cultural evolution, not biological, but cultural evolution, since the advent of agriculture about 10,000 years ago. But what I really want to focus on, in a way, is what made all that possible. And in particular, what made possible the development of certain kinds of institutions that will incentivize moral behavior, that in large groups where many of us are strangers to one another, we can still trust one another in the course of interactions, we can still get on. Now, there are a couple of background points that I think are really important for how I'm going to develop this, and so I want to just kind of digress for a moment and take a bit of time to explain this. Almost all of our workaday concepts, whether it's house or river or mountain or vegetable or friend or foe, are concepts that are organized radially, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. At the center of the category are what we call the prototypes, the exemplars, the things we all agree upon. For example, in the case of a vegetable, we all agree, at least in this culture, that carrots are prototypical vegetables. There's many ways of testing this, but it's fairly clear. If, for example, you asked an undergraduate class, name the first vegetable that comes to your mind, about 90% of them will say carrot. That's fine. And that does seem to be the way our categories are organized. And out from the prototypes that are less, where there is slightly less agreement, but there is still similarity to the prototypes, are other things. So radishes, for example, are not prototypical vegetables, because some of you will probably say, well, they're not really vegetables at all. Or you might say that about parsley, for example, and similarly about mushrooms. And yet you do find them in the vegetable section of the supermarket. Now, the point that this is actually an important point, because many people get terribly hung up on the idea of definitions, and that for any sort of case that you can drum up, there has to be an answer to it. It isn't so. Is there an answer to whether parsley is really a vegetable? I don't think so. If we cared a lot about whether parsley was a vegetable for some reason, then we would ask the lawyers to work it out for us. And they would make a precise definition, and if it was in our interest, we would live by it. But most of us really don't care about parsley. And the same is true of our social categories. As children learn what it is to be honest or to tell the truth, to be generous, or what it is to be stingy or miserable or to bully, they learn by prototypical cases, by seeing that that's an instance of it. They also learn by these very poignant and memorable stories where someone is particularly stupid or particularly miserable or particularly stingy. And they learn then the prototypes of these moral concepts. They learn what's a little on the outside, and they learn about the fuzzy boundaries, because we all know that even for something like truth-telling, you better not always tell the truth, or you will certainly get into trouble. And moral and not moral, I think, are similar in that way. That is, there are prototypical cases of what it is to be moral. There are some that are a bit further out, and there's fuzzy boundaries. Now, there are a couple of other related points that I want to make in this context. One is that house is also one of these categories that is organized with a radial structure. But notice that what is a prototypical house varies across cultures. So in West Vancouver, let's say, that's going to be a prototypical house. But if you live in the Arctic, it's going to look something like that. Paul's mom was born in one of those, so for her, for many years, that was a prototypical house, and so forth. Now, this is relevant to our topic because what we are going to see is that relative to particular kinds of ecological systems and relative perhaps to history, you may see slight differences in moral practices, moral norms, and moral standards. And they may then be understood in something like this sort of way. Now, the other reason that I want to stress this point about our ordinary categories being organized as radially, is that it turns out that artificial neural networks, which roughly, but only roughly, seem to approximate real neural networks, seem to learn in much the same way. And I illustrate here a very simple case. What we do is we provide to the input pictures of male faces or pictures of female faces. And then we send a signal up to the next layer where there are weights which can go up or down and increase or decrease the value of the signal, and then to the output layer. Now, of course, initially that neural network knows nothing, but it can be trained by seeing picture after picture and getting the answer yes or getting the answer no. So we would show it pictures like the ones that you see at the bottom. Now, after a while, it learns to categorize very accurately, and then you can present it with completely new pictures and ask it to categorize, and it will do so very well. You can then present it with an ambiguous face, or a face that is partially draped with a scarf or a curtain. It will still get the right answer. Now, when we look at that center layer to see how it does that, it looks like it does it in pretty much the same way that I was talking about. That is, there are prototypes, and then there are cases that are a little further out, and then there are fuzzy boundaries. This gives us some expectation, although these are very early days, and I have to really caution you on that, to think that the story about prototypes and categories fits very well with what we know about the nervous system. Whereas learning categories by necessary and sufficient conditions or definitions doesn't actually seem to work quite so well. So now I want to return to the question of values. So the question that I want to ask is even more basic than where do moral values come from. I want to ask, what is it for neurons or for a nervous system to have values of any kind? What could that possibly mean? And we do have an understanding of that. What we know is that every organism that has a nervous system has one that's organized to see to its own welfare, to see that it has energy resources, that it's warm, and that it's safe. And as organisms and nervous systems evolved and became more complex, it was possible for the brainstem to set priorities amongst some of the things that the organism might need. And so if it was very thirsty, but it saw a predator, the brainstem circuitry then says it's better to run and you can have a drink later. And so we see that there are very powerful evolutionary forces at work to make sure that an organism sees to its own well-being and its own survival. And in a sense, that's the very deepest level of value that there is. Now you might say, how then is it ever possible to get altruism? How is it ever possible to have any organism, however complex, to sacrifice its own immediate interests for those of another? And now we come to the change in mammalian brains. So consider the world of reptiles, of dinosaurs and lizards and newts and snakes and frogs and so forth. They are all cold-blooded. And at some point, about 200 million years ago, there began to be certain very interesting changes. And warm-blooded, kind of intermediate sauropsids, not yet mammals, but not exactly reptiles, began to appear. They were warm-blooded. And the great thing about being warm-blooded is you can feed at night. And what's around at night? Well, all of these newts and lizards that can't move because it's cold and they're waiting for the sun to come up, right? Free dinner. And so mammals did the warm-blooded animals did extremely well. The other thing that was great about it was they could go to foraging places where the cold-blooded animals couldn't go. And so they had much greater flexibility. The downside, of course, is that you need much more energy. You have to have about 10 times the intake of food, or calories, if you, size for size, if you're warm-blooded. So that meant they had to have a lot more to eat. And that means that whereas you could have lots of lizards on one patch, you can't have anything like as many mammals on that patch. So how did that change the evolution of the mammalian brain, or contribute to the evolution of the mammalian brain? It did so in the following way. Instead of having lots and lots of babies and then wandering off, you have a few and you take care of them. And so what we see is, with the beginnings of the proto-mammals, is something very new. And this required rewiring very important parts of the subcortical structures, in particular the hypothalamus. And oxytocin, which I mentioned earlier, began to be put to a new use. If I can be anthropomorphic for a moment, what Mother Nature had to do was rig it so that the mammals cared for the offspring as though they were themselves. So just as me, the mother rat, takes care of my own warmth and food and safety, so for my babies, I take care of their warmth and food and safety. So it's as though me extends to mine. Now, it's not as though the animal is confused about the difference. It's just that care extends. So we go from an organism that is essentially only looking to its own welfare and needs to one that considers the welfare and needs of others almost as profoundly. Now, part of what happened in this change was that oxytocin was important in establishing an attachment between mothers and offspring, or between fathers and offspring. And as also were the endogenous opiates, which make you feel good when they are released. And so when the baby and the parents are together, you feel good. When they are separated, you feel pain. And the mother will act accordingly. In addition to that, because the newborn mammals are born very immature relative to a newborn turtle, which can just hatch and then, carry on to the ocean. The immaturity, although it has the price that the mom has to take care of it, it has this amazing benefit. And the benefit is that the brain can tune itself up to all kinds of different environments. It can learn to accommodate itself to many different kinds of environments, no matter what particular kinds of things happen. Now, if you're Mother Nature and you want to have an animal with great flexibility, you can either go in and change the genes so that you cover all those contingencies by building a brain with all the right connections. They would all be instinctual. Very expensive, very slow, didn't happen. Because the thing that's cheaper and faster is to make a brain that's immature but can learn like crazy. And that's really what you have in the case of mammals. So, but to have that and to have this advantage of being warm-blooded, you have to have this circuitry And this is a huge difference between mammals and reptiles to care for others. Now, which others, of course, is going to vary between species as a function of how they make their living and what their particular evolutionary pressures are. Now, just because it sometimes is useful, I just want to say a little bit about what the cortex is. All right, so what you're looking at here is a slice of a mammalian brain taken this way, okay? You're not looking at it from the side, you're looking at it as a slice. And it's stained to make the cortex show purple. So notice that what you've got is this little, oopsie, where'd that go? Hey, come back. Oh no, get back. There we go. So it's just the kind of outer rind, if you like. And all of the white stuff in between are the axons that course from the cortex to other places. And if you take a little section of cortex and blow it up, what you're seeing is something that looks like this. And it itself has this amazing 6-layer structure. I mention that also because I want you to know that there are other things in the brain that changed also probably as a result of these needs for mammals to have this kind of sociability. So a turtle brain or a lizard brain doesn't have a cortex that looks like that. It's got this kind of sloppy, maybe kind of 2-layer thing, which isn't to say they're stupid. I mean, they're not slugs. But they can't do the computation and the abstraction. They can't do the recollection and the skill learning that can be done by mammals. So as I said, all vertebrates have oxytocin and vasopressin, which are very, very similar, and I just give a picture there schematically of what the molecule looks like. And one of the things that's kind of interesting about oxytocin and vasopressin is that in the female, oxytocin is massively released during parturition as the baby is being delivered, and it's massively released in the brain. In addition, during lactation, it's released in the brain both of the infant and of the mother. And this is a very important part. The cuddling, it doesn't actually have to be lactation, although that's probably a good idea, but the cuddling and the nurturing and all of that is very important for both lactation, both for oxytocin release in the mother and in the infant. Now, this is a slide I put up here just to remind myself to tell you that there are many things besides oxytocin that are important. I'm highlighting it because in a way it's the central player. Okay, so that gives us the big story, genetically speaking, of how you get from only my interest counts to the interest of the others count very much like my own. How do you get from that to caring about things that aren't offspring that are part of your species or in your group? And now I'm going to tell you a story about voles. And many of you will know this story, but it's such a wonderful story. And it was really this discovery that kind of gave me the insight into understanding attachment and trust as essential to the platform for moral behavior. All right, so voles, you can see what they look like. This is a pair of prairie voles. It's hard to know which one is the male. It could be this one because they do tend to kind of huddle over the babies. There are many species of voles. Prairie voles are very interesting, and this was discovered by Sue Carter. Prairie voles, male and female, after the first mating, are bonded for life. They stay together, they hang out together, they like to be together. The male will guard the nest against intruders. The male helps, as he does in this picture, to take care of the young. He'll huddle over them and he'll protect them, and he will sometimes bring food for them. There are other voles that are very different. Montane voles, for example, and meadow voles. In those instances, there is no long-term mate preference. The male takes no part in the rearing of the pups, and there is no guarding of the nest. So Sue Carter asked this question: what's the difference in the brains? And they found an answer. And the answer goes like this. Now, what I have to tell you first, before I explain this, is this. So oxytocin is a chemical in the brain. It's also in the body. Oxytocin in the brain, to have an effect, has to bind to a receptor on a neuron. And then it will change something about the activity of that neuron. So there has to both be the oxytocin and there has to be the receptor. And the same, of course, is true of vasopressin and just about any other neurochemical. So what they wanted to know eventually was, if the brains differ, what should we be looking for? And they figured out, finally, that they needed to look for the difference in density of receptors for oxytocin and receptors for vasopressin, and this is what they found. All right, so here you're looking at a montane vole. Does that show up okay? Yeah. Here you're looking at a montane vole. This means oxytocin receptor. Here you're looking at a prairie vole brain. And again, you're looking at a slice this way. What they found was that in the prairie voles, but not in the montane voles, you have a high density of receptors for oxytocin in the nucleus accumbens. It's not you have none in the montane, it's you have a very high density in the prairie vole. And what about vasopressin? For vasopressin receptors, you have a very high density of receptors in what's called the ventral pallidum in the prairie vole, but not in the montane vole. Interesting fact, nucleus accumbens and ventral pallidum are both part of the reward system. All right, so that's only a correlation. So then they did all the manipulations that you can imagine. You get yourself male and female prairie vole, they haven't mated yet, you block the oxytocin receptors, what happens? They mate, they don't bond. Or else what you can do is you can genetically alter mice, and I'll show you a little bit how that goes in the next slide, actually. Let me just go back from the mice for a moment. So Larry Young at Emory thought, well, look, if what you're seeing is a different density of receptors for vasopressin and oxytocin in those very specific places in the prairie vole, there must be a genetic difference. And he found one. And here is a schematic. This is actually from Larry Young. So this is the montane vole, and over here you got your prairie vole. These are both males. And in the case of the montane vole, this region, which you call a microsatellite, which regulates the expression of that part of DNA that's responsible for making the protein that is the receptor. It's a different size, and it's much larger in the case of the prairie vole. Now, before you get too excited, I have to tell you this doesn't generalize to all animals that show strong mate preference. That TT monkeys show it and marmosets show it, and we don't find the same gene involved. But this is the gene, it seems, that's involved in the case of prairie and montane voles. So what they did then was they took mice because you can do the genetics, and they altered them genetically, and if you made their genes look like that of the prairie vole, by gosh, they mated and they bonded and were very attached and really liked to hang out together and so forth. Now this was amazing to me, that this very simple peptide, although in the context of very complicated circuitry and other chemicals, could make that difference. And that you could manipulate behavior by manipulating that. And that's a social behavior that actually I'd been led to believe as a teenager was something that we came to rationally, right? That rational people are monogamous. I don't know. Well, I don't know. So, it seems that social urges, of course, involve pleasure and pain caused by social interactions. So in addition then to our having these attachments. We feel pain under certain conditions, disapproval, shunning, and so forth, and we feel pleasure when we are with them. It's an interesting thing that Larry Young did. He took a basket of prairie voles, and he kind of distributed them around the room, and within minutes, they were all kind of back together. This is really, this is great. He took montane voles and did the same thing, nothing. They were happy. They're loners. They're like those prospectors. So there are highly social mammals. We're pretty highly social, but so are marmosets, who do also bond for life, and the male takes a part in the rearing of the young. So now what I'm interested in is not just care of the offspring and care for mates, but also kin, and in some senses, in some instances, friends and others in the group. And I think it's fairly easy to see that the way the system works, it's not difficult to expand care and attachment and concern beyond the immediate family. Although it remains a very interesting fact that in general parents care most about their own offspring, and then it kind of falls off thereafter. And I think it seems to be a very typical and common human behavior. So what does oxytocin really do, you might want to know? Well, that is now a topic for very intense research in many labs. And we know a little bit, but there's much that remains still very puzzling. We know that at a behavioral level, it decreases defensive posture. So very often animals are quite vigilant and alert when a new animal enters. And then, depending on what happens, they may relax and everything is fine. We know at the level of the brain that there is, to a first approximation at any rate, a kind of opposition between oxytocin levels and stress hormone levels. So when stress hormone levels go up, oxytocin goes down, and vice versa. And so part of the reason we feel good in a social context is that oxytocin levels go up and our stress hormones go down. Stress hormones make us feel anxious, alert, it's unpleasant. It also turns out that oxytocin has receptors in a subcortical structure called the amygdala, which we know is important for processing, amongst other things, for processing fear responses. And it's as though it downregulates fear responses. And it also affects the brainstem and downregulates the fight and flight response and upregulates the rest and digest response. All right, I want to say just a little bit about tuning up the reward system. Not very much, except to say that, of course, the reward system is a very important part always of learning. And in the next slide, you'll see, let's see, what's the best way to do this? I guess this is going to, okay. So this thing that you see here in blue is the ventral tegmental area, which is really important for releasing dopamine, and it does it there, and also to the frontal structures right here. The amygdala, which I mentioned earlier, which is important for processing fear, is here, and notice that there's also an interaction there. Notice that the nucleus accumbens, which I said was where there was a higher density of receptors for oxytocin, it's part of the reward system. And notice how there's all of these interactions between all of these centers that have to do with processing, planning, social responses, calculating consequences, and so forth. Now, we don't in detail understand how this works. But this is a very important, I think, element to help us. So social animals like to be together, for example, wolves. And one of the things that almost certainly happens is that when social animals are together, it makes it easier for them to engage in cooperation, whether that has to do with defense against intruders and predators, or whether it has to do with themselves being predators. And then in this particular instance, which I showed earlier in this week, these, of course, are wolves, which howl to bring in the others. And they, as you all know, if you have dogs, the dogs get together and they jump on each other and they lick and they da-da-da. And then the alpha male mounts everybody, so everybody knows who's the alpha male, and off they go. And here they are doing this really incredible thing. So here's the grizzly who's brought down a caribou and has just begun to tuck in, and of course the wolves arrive, and the wolves will harass him until they drive him off, and they will. And over here we have, yes, the raven, who alerted the wolves, yes, and guided the wolves to where this was, and eventually he'll go back and get his chums. They will all come, and then they'll harass and harass and harass the wolves, and then they'll get what remains. Now, I just want to mention a couple of other quick things before I end. I know this is a cheesy slide, right? I know that. But I really like this slide. And so I figured out something to say about it. But actually, I do want to make a serious point. That serious point is how flexible social mammals are in their behavior. That, you know, there's always a kind of normal set of circumstances where a very typical kind of behavior is seen. So we all know that orangutans are loners, right? And in Borneo, all of the field studies that have been done shows that they are loners. And that's, of course, because they eat mostly leaves, and so they each need a vast territory. Of course, the mothers are not entirely loners when they have a young one, but as soon as the young one is independent, they all become loners again. And so there had been this impression about orangutans that they were essentially unsocial. But it turns out that if the resources are plentiful and if conditions are right, they're actually very social. And what I think so interesting in a way about this slide is that I should just tell you where this was, actually. This was in Iowa, where there is a rescue center where the orang happened to be. And he was kind of a loner while he was in the rescue center. He didn't consort much with the chimpanzees and others. And then one day this old coonhound comes loping in. And the coonhound kind of looks around and he looks around and he finds Rusty. And they bond. And they actually have apparently been inseparable since. But look, I mean, the social behavior is really quite interesting. The arm around them, and it's not fake, by the way. All right. So I'll just finish with a couple of quick comments. And one is, of course, so far the story has been about cooperation and reconciliation and so forth. But of course, there's always aggression and tension and competition within the group. It's not like times are always jolly. And what's very interesting about social mammals, and we can see this by field observations more particularly than captive, is how animals will reconcile, that there is a limit to what is tolerated in terms of bad behavior and tension, and that others will gang up on a badly behaved member, and in some cases they will boot him out of the group. And we also know from field studies that a loner does not do well. That a lone baboon or a lone coyote or a lone wolf has to scrounge all on his own for food, does not do well against predators, and typically has a much, much shorter life. And so you can understand why part of the circuitry is devoted to making sure that the animal feels pain when there's disapproval, when there's punishment, and when there's shunning. It works very well. So I'm going to conclude with two slides. First, then, of course, it's a reasonable question. Where do our very explicit rules and explicit laws come from? And I think many people who study cultural evolution think that once there was agriculture and once groups became very large, trade increased, that there was a need for regularizing transactions between strangers. And in other words, the trust that used to obtain between individuals as a result of, you're giving me the eye or wagging your finger at me and so forth, that sort of moral suasion between individuals and where we trust one another had to be altered in the context of dealing with strangers. And there it makes sense to sort of invest your trust in the institution, as we do in the case of banks. I mean, isn't it amazing? You walk into a bank and you hand this perfect stranger money and you think you're going to get it back eventually? I mean, it's amazing, really. And the other thing then, and this harkens back to the first slide, probably at about that same time we see the development of organized religion, and in particular with the idea that when you're not around others, there is an unseen guy that sees you. It kind of looks like Calgary, but I think it's Texas. All right. So in summary, I just want to say then that the foundation on which everything is built, of course, is the structure of self-maintenance, self-welfare, self-care. But out of that can grow and did evolve this additional circuitry with this other very much more complicated set of properties. That there are self plus offspring values, and that these, under the right circumstances and given the right sort of evolutionary and ecological conditions, can develop into animals that expand care to kin and to others in the group, and ultimately possibly to strangers. Humans, of course, have a brain that is much bigger. It has no different structures than what a rat has. We just have more neurons. We have about 86 billion. Cortex varies over about 5 orders of magnitude between little rats and us, or little mice and us. We've got more neurons. We've got more stuff to go between sensory and motor, so you can get more and more abstract, more and more imaginative, more and more planning. And I think roughly that is the story of how you get from there to here. Thank you for your time.